I'm Catherine Morrison, and I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the Scarborough Library. I'm joined behind the scenes by Lucy Norval, who is our Coordinator of Programming and Communications. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program on Maine Shorebirds. I want to thank the Friends of Scarborough Marsh who are partnering with us on this program tonight. Before I introduce our presenter, I'm going to play the library's land acknowledgement adopted by the library's Board of Trustees. It's read by Alan T. Paul, member of the Maliseet Nation and library trustee.
The Scarborough Public Library acknowledges that it is located in the traditional homeland, past and present, of tribes in the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize and honor the current tribes who comprise the Confederacy: the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseets, and the Micmac, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We acknowledge the Owaskoag people who once lived in what is now Scarborough. We respect the traditional values of these tribes and support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences.
Thank you. So I want to introduce tonight's speaker. Brad Zitsky is the shorebird biologist at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. He earned a bachelor's degree in natural resources and wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's from the University of New Brunswick, with a focus on avian demographics and landscape ecology. He has nearly 25 years of field experience concentrating on avian and small mammal research in North America. He's worked as a consultant for the wind power industry and with governments and organizations in the US, Canada, and Costa Rica. He worked extensively with endangered and threatened species in his previous position as regional wildlife biologist for DIFW. He is currently the shorebird specialist at that agency, and we're very thrilled that he was able to join us tonight to share his knowledge about shorebirds in Maine and some local to Scarborough. So welcome, Brad.
Thank
Turn
you,
it over to
Catherine.
you.
Okay, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I see quite a few familiar names in the chat. And hello to all of my former Friends of Scarborough Marsh colleagues there. I'm glad you could join in, and certainly some other folks whose names I recognize too from our piping plover work. We'll be touching on that a little bit later, but right now I'm going to share my screen. Yes, as Catherine mentioned, I'm Brad Zitsky. I've been the shorebird specialist for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife for this is my second year in that role. I worked as a regional biologist in southern Maine for 8 years with our department as well, kind of doing a more general suite of duties, more specialized in this role on shorebirds. So I'm thrilled to talk to you all tonight about shorebirds in Maine. There's a lovely flock on my title screen here. So what are we going to talk about tonight? Why shorebirds? Why are they important? They're kind of an oft forgotten about group of birds, kind of get downplayed by the more charismatic raptors or colorful warbler species that grace us in the spring and fall and throughout the summer. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about some of the main players that we can see in and around Scarborough, either breeders or just passing through. I'm going to talk about a little bit of research that's going on in the state, past and present, on whimbrels and upland sandpipers. And I'm just going to touch a little bit, like I mentioned, on the piping plover program. So I really like this slide here. This is a slide that National Audubon Society put together, and all of these species are to scale with each other. So it really gives a cool look at the variety in shapes and colors And one thing, of course, that most shorebirds have in common are those long, very unique bills, and they're all slightly different from each other. From the marbled godwit on the left, slightly upcurved, very long and thin, to the oyster catcher, more broad. And it really depends on what their preferred foraging food is, how they've adapted those types of bills. So here we go. Why shorebirds? Well, first off, they're excellent indicators of important habitats. They're not going to go to places where A, there's no food source for them, and B, there's not important roosting habitat where they're easily disturbed. They're really a strong indicator. I really, as a biologist, don't like the phrase canary in a coal mine, but they really are as well. They face a lot of complex threats because they migrate from South America, in some cases, extreme South America, all the way up to the Arctic twice a year. And of course, they reach a lot of issues along the way on both directions. So that's what I mean by complex threats. And it all depends on the location, from over harvesting of horseshoe crabs and horseshoe crab eggs in the Delaware Bay that really impact these guys on the left here, red knots, who are amazingly dependent on hitting these horseshoe crab emergence in the spring when they come on the shore and lay their eggs. The red knots time their migration when those horseshoe crabs are coming up and they gobble up all the eggs. It's thought that well over half of the red knot population in the world visits Delaware Bay every year. And there have been some emerging technologies out there that are extracting chemicals from the horseshoe crab eggs and reducing that food source. That's just one teeny example from the mid-Atlantic. Of course, climate change is a big thing, changing their prey, making the timing of when these birds migrate and pass through really, really important. And like I said, they are considered super migrants with really complex geographies using tidal marshes, salt marshes, in some cases, which I'll talk about a little bit later, blueberry barrens and grasslands. But really, primarily, the most important reason I study them is because they're one of the taxa that's decreasing at one of the highest rates. There's a lot going on this slide. I'm sure everyone's heard about the state of the birds that have been updated the last 2 years and these dramatic declines over the decades. And shorebirds are one of the highest hit birds that have really suffered from declines in population. Overall, since 1970, North American bird populations have dropped 30%. And there's a ton of information out there. This is a great website here that really puts things into perspective with access to digital media and articles, scholarly articles one can read, or how to help, what you can do to make this a bird-friendly place. Something as simple that a lot of people take for granted is just leaving your cats inside. Cats are incredibly destructive, and there's been loads of research on cats. Putting up bird-friendly windows, thinking about that in some of our newer construction areas too. And they really stage in these incredibly large numbers. And they're really vulnerable to disturbance, like that picture on the upper left here. You see the dog uplifting all of these birds. And for the most part, big groups of these birds, like these Sanderlings on the bottom right, are only here for 1 or 2 weeks at a time, excuse me, when they have to put on as much fat reserve as they can. Oftentimes, having their weight, sometimes even equaling their weight within a matter of a week or two. So they really are sensitive to being flushed when they're feeding in these large numbers like this. Consider a 200-pound person that would have to eat 100 pounds of food in a couple of weeks, and it really puts things into perspective. And the scale of these guys, of course, is very small, but they're really sensitive. And I think we've all seen a photo like the one on the upper left here as we were walking on the beaches. Even just people that are completely oblivious and lifting up these flocks, sending them to the air and using valuable energy reserves when they should be stuffing themselves, basically. We have an incredible diversity, as I showed on one of those first slides, with some of the larger birds like marbled godwit or the whimbrels, and the whimbrel in the upper left here. Incredibly diverse, from sandpipers and plovers, knots, like the upper right there. You see the colored bands on this particular knot's legs. That's a species that's been getting more and more attention, tracking how they move, where they go, and people are using citizen science to their benefit while observing or reciting, as we call it, marked individuals. And that's not the only species that's tagged in the Western Hemisphere or the world, really. It's a really important way to monitor progress of populations. And I'll talk more specifically about a couple of those projects later on. But this is really just to illustrate some of the incredible diversity out there. And a picture like the bottom left, there's a really common one that we can see on our Maine beaches, Semipalmated plover, which is a cousin of the piping plover above it in the middle left, with a couple of these other more drab colored peeps that are very common in the summer and fall. So what are some species I should mention here that any of these can be seen in Maine, different times of years. The only nesters here we have are the piping plover, American oyster catcher, or an American oyster catcher out of all these pictures here. There's also yellowlegs that breed here, spotted sandpipers, willet, like on the right. Willets are one of the more common and conspicuous noisy shorebirds that we have. When they look pretty drab when they're stationary or walking, but when they alight in the air, they have a very distinct white, almost like a V pattern on their wings, and they're very loud. Black-bellied plovers are species that pass through. Killdeer is often mistaken for our piping plovers, which of course are nesters here. When I get a call from somebody saying they've got a piping plover nesting in their in the ball field in Wyndham, I know it's going to be a killdeer. They have really broad areas that they choose to nest, parking lots. I'm sure we've all got stories of weird killdeer, ball fields and driveways, gravel driveways and such. Also one of the more common shorebird species here. I mentioned our yellowlegs, greater and lesser yellowlegs. And these can be tough to tell apart in the field unless they're together. You can really get an indication of their different sizes in a picture like this where they're both in the same screen. But what I like to do is I use the bill length in proportion to the head. So this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the bill length on the greater yellowlegs is quite a bit longer than in proportion to its head. This isn't the best photo of this lesser, but they're roughly equivalent to the proportion of their head. They are about 2 inches size difference or so, which is more obvious, like I said, when you could see them in the same picture like this. This is probably one of our most numerous as far as individuals go, unfortunately, the semi-palmated sandpiper has really been dropping in numbers over the years. When I was doing my master's research in New Brunswick, Canada, some of you may be familiar with the importance of the Bay of Fundy to migrating shorebirds, where the basically Gulf of Maine pours into the Bay of Fundy with the incredibly high tides. And there were some places in New Brunswick, one called Mary's Point, where you could go and see these guys by the tens of thousands, and just really, really remarkable. I've heard from some of my friends and colleagues up there that those numbers, they're not seeing those kind of numbers anymore. And that was only 20 years ago. This individual on the left, it's kind of tough to see. Again, I can't tell if people can see my cursor or not, but there's this little thin line here. This is actually a bird equipped with a transmitter backpack, and that's the whip antenna. That's the transmitter on the back. They're often worn as like a harness around their legs. And you can get a lot of just really impressive movement data from tracked birds. And that's a species that's been kind of on the watch list. So they don't really come through here in the spring in large numbers, but really around middle or late July, you'll start to see the adults passing through. They come in stages, adult males, adult females, and then the juveniles will come later. So they spread out throughout the course of a couple of months that we really start to see good numbers of peeps. Then, typically speaking, the best migratory shorebird timing is August and September. And that's certainly true of these guys. And
Brad, it's Catherine. I'm just going to tell you that we can see your cursor. So
Okay.
that is working.
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you. And semi-palmated sandpipers are named because they have full palmation is in between toes, like the webbing of a duck's feet. That's called being palmated. These guys have kind of a half palmation in between their toes. Over here, I don't have a great picture of it. I was looking, and it really helps. It kind of like helps them stay above that soft mud a little bit, almost like a snowshoe a little bit. And they're part of a larger group of birds, shorebirds called peeps, that are often clumped in together because they can be very difficult to tell apart, to identify from other individuals, like the least sandpiper here. And there's different plumages too, so it really makes it tough. The juveniles look different from adults when they start passing through. And this is the smallest shorebird that we have. And unlike the semi-palmated sandpiper, the leasts have kind of a yellowish green leg there. Whereas, so not a great picture, but semi-palms have darker legs. And they're often seen together. This is a very common species. I'll often get calls in the summertime from folks saying, I saw 40 piping plovers together on Higgins Beach. And I'm saying, probably not. This is more than likely their closely related cousin, the semi-palmated plover. I like to say that they look like they were dipped in mud, and piping plovers look like they were dipped in sand. So slightly darker versus the sand color of a piping plover. And they'll feed much like piping plovers on marine worms or little invertebrates. It's amazing what you see them pulling out sometimes through those little holes in the intertidal zones. Sanderling is another common species that folks will see on the beach. They're a very active bird species. I like to say they chase the waves. They go back and forth a lot with the incoming and outgoing surf. and they're much lighter colored, a little heavier than those semi-palmated sandpipers too. And yeah, chasing the waves there with the really thicker, darker bill than those other species. This is a species that's not as common, but can certainly be seen. They're fairly plain. Big thing to keep in ID help here with my cursor is that's actually the wing, these darker feathers here, when it's spread out, that go beyond the tail, which is underneath there. Whereas on this Sanderling here, that's the tail, and these are the wings. So it looks quite a bit longer, like it has a longer tail, but they're actually the wings on the white rumps, and they're a little bit bigger than the other species too. All these guys take a lot of time to practice and study. So don't be thrown off if you think they all look the same to me, but that's why we often just call them peeps, because they can be really tough to tell apart when they're in numbers of several hundred together. We will see Dunlin passing through here in the spring. They look like these guys up there, or some cross between these two. They get drabber in the winter time, and then molt. They do start, you will see some in the springtime, some Dunlin. It's a species that's more common in the spring than the fall migration. You'll see some molting into this brighter, bolder adult plumage in the springtime too. Good places in Scarborough or Pine Point, just a fantastic birding spot. Not so much the beach side unless the tide is out, but around the cove by the harbor there. Ferry Beach and Western Beach, more so Western because they don't allow dogs in the summertime, are great spots. And even up into the salt marshes in Scarborough Marsh, typically when the tide is up, birds will be pushed up into those salt marshes. And this is more of an indicative coast of mid-coast or down east Maine, much more rockier than our sandy beaches in southern Maine. And you will see some roosting birds in this cobble here. You can tell how they really just blend in here, where I'm pointing at individual birds with my cursor here. It's kind of like one of those old magic eye puzzles. Once you start getting an idea for the shape of a bird, they really do start to, oh, wow, there it is. There's another one. There's another one. And they like areas when they're roosting that are less disturbed. That's why more so on our sandy beaches, but roosting birds will go up into the marsh and inhabit some of the salt pans and pools into the salt marsh. And certainly, of course, above the high water mark. But on our sandy beaches at high tide, there's not much beach for birds and people to coexist, and people usually win that battle. This is more of a common scene as well, roosting shorebirds nestled in among the rocks here. Lubeck Flats is a fantastic spot for birding, shore birding in August, late July, August. It's a really expansive mud flat that supports large numbers of shorebirds, especially in fall migration. What are some of the threats that shorebirds face? Well, they face a tough life on the beach, be it a breeder or a migrant. And there's a lot of critters out there that would love to munch on a piping plover egg or dig under some fencing. These are plover related pictures, but certainly migratory shorebirds are at risk of all of these critters too. And of course, just the nature of where they are. Birds are sensitive to tides and sea level rise. The numbers do not look great for the next 30 years. Projections of 1.5 feet, 2 feet sea level rise. So a beach like this is going to be just gone. And this beach grass will be inundated and therefore no longer able to grow, amongst a whole suite of other issues with sea level rise. But really, I bring up this dog disturbance picture again up here on the upper left, but that's a biggie for folks to realize that there's actually wildlife that live on these beaches and need those beaches to live, be it breeders like a piping plover or a willet or a spotted sandpiper, or these huge numbers of migrants that pass through and treat us like a grocery store. But if they're not allowed access to the grocery store, then their numbers are going to be even lower than they already are. And of course, a beach in Maine in April looks a lot different to a bird than a beach in Maine in August, like this down here. Other things like fireworks, and this is on Pine Point, so is this picture actually. As many of you know, it's kind of a veritable dog park out there at times. This is a picture a colleague took at Pine Point where a woman opened a van door and it was like a clown car. All these dogs kept piling out. There were 9 different dogs in that particular van. And of course, this guy here came right out and to do his business, and the woman was nowhere to be seen, from what I understand. So that type of thing's not really helping any birds or people for that matter, but I won't go get on my soapbox about that one. But the biggest threat really is just ignorance and people not knowing that these birds are out there. So we do quite a bit of outreach to folks. We try to, at least to increase awareness of how amazing Maine is. We can support over 30 species of shorebirds here in the state. And that's one of the highest numbers of diversity along the Atlantic seaboard. I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about, some of the work that colleagues have done in North and South America on the whimbrel, which is one of the largest shorebirds that we get, excuse me, in Maine. Whimbrels are, very unique. Not just are they a gorgeous bird with that cool striped head, long down curved bill, but they're really unique in that where they breed kind of dictates where they are going to, their migratory patterns and routes. Birds that breed, so these names here, Sachem and Ahanu, this is courtesy of colleagues in Manomet. For those that don't know, Manomet is an amazing ecological company or group, kind of like the Nature Conservancy. They've started out in Massachusetts. They also have an office in Brunswick and Fort Andros. And they do a lot of ecological work, and especially bird work on the Cape. And these are 2 birds that were banded as part of a long-term monitoring project and fitted with GPS transmitters. I'll come back to this map in a bit. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of this transmitter. Again, there's a little whip antenna on this whimbrel. You can see this guy with the whip hanging out there. And there's one. And again, this is a harness that fits like a figure 8 around their legs. And it has kind of a stretchy cord that goes up and under their wings. And it has a solar panel on it, so it can actually recharge. And one of these birds, Sachem, was banded as a juvenile on its way down. Banded as a juvenile on Cape Cod. was where it was initially banded. That's where the star is there. And hard to tell, but this is a lighter color. This is Sacham's path. But unfortunately, it died before it could either died or it lost its transmitter, or the transmitter stopped breaking, or sometimes the feathers will grow over the solar transmitter, so it won't, the solar batteries, so they won't transmit anymore. But that bird made a 4-day straight journey down to South America after it was banded, halfway through its migration, because they don't breed in Cape Cod. So it was banded as a hatchier juvenile bird in the summer of 2018. And it likely bred somewhere around here as well, and flew all the way down to Venezuela. And another bird that they have, and all this information's on their website, you can actually go check it out. I poached this from their website, in fact, but there's a lot of really cool information that just goes to show you how many, or how long and how different the migratory paths are of these long distance migrants like shorebirds. After this Wimbrel project, I'll bring up a little bit about upland sandpiper work that I've been doing the last couple of years. And that's some really interesting, cool stuff too. So the other individual, Ahanu, it was, let's see, I think the story was that was banded on its breeding ground as they were doing some research up there. And they actually got enough data on it to track its southward migration. And it went up in the Hudson Bay area from the Arctic tundra, Hudson Bay area, straight trip down to Cape Cod, where it fed, filling up with that grocery store on the mud flats, like I mentioned. And then it made a direct trip, also 4 days, but even farther down to Suriname and Guyana, bumped around there for a little while, and then it went down to Brazil, where it spent the rest of its winter. And from there, the following spring, it made a straight trip back north to the Gulf Coast of Texas. These are just two individuals who had pretty different routes. Unfortunately, this guy, Sachem, stopped transmitting, but they got a full annual cycle from the transmitter on Ahanu. And just remarkable when you think of how few sites there are here. So if, for instance, say this one site that's really important from Wimbrels in Texas has an oil spill or gets thrashed by a hurricane or something like that, that one site can be incredibly devastating to bird species that use those areas. And I mentioned red knots and their dependence on the horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay, same type of thing. There's a lot of issues all along the route, as you can imagine, predation all along the way. A big issue that's really come to mind in the last decade or so in northern South America and the Caribbean countries are unregulated hunting. So of course, folks in third world nations are going to do whatever they can to eat and subsist. So there's large numbers of birds, shorebirds, that are killed on migration, because the locals know that this time of year they're going to get thousands of birds passing through. So why not set up nets and shoot them? And there's been a lot of work that Manomet's been doing on the wintering grounds in some of those countries and incorporating partners in Latin America to help educate locals about the risks and how the numbers are really dwindling to scary numbers. So talk about this project that I've been doing for the last 2 years. This is not it, but trying to look at some of the movements of upland sandpiper. I didn't mention some of the surveys. I won't say work or research because it hasn't been really anything scientific, but we've done some surveys for whimbrels and upland sandpipers in down East Maine to try to get an idea of how much these birds are using the blueberry barrens that are so huge up there, those thousands of acres of industrial blueberries that make one of the many things that makes Maine famous, of course. But both whimbrels and upland sandpipers will actually breed in those blueberry fields. Whimbrels, we found that they use those blueberry barrens as their roosting sites and secondary feeding sites when at certain tidal cycles down east. So it got us looking more and more at the importance of these blueberry fields. And some of the research out there on upland sandpipers, there's a fantastic suite of data from Alaska and their migratory routes through Western North America and into South America, but not really a whole lot done with uppies, as I like to call them, in the eastern part of the range. But Vermont, some folks in Vermont did some work fairly recently, and this map on the right is really, it's kind of a busy map, but think about the orange as southbound migration and the green as northbound migration. And each one of these lines is one individual. And the birds that nest in the eastern part of North America have really quite different migratory pathways that go southbound. When they leave to go southbound, they go directly over the ocean. Oftentimes don't even stop in the in the Caribbean, and end up in northern South America. Northbound, they'll go over and kind of island hop up to Florida and go all the way up along the coast. Western birds will use that Yucatan Peninsula, or the narrowing of Mexico here. And it's just really cool information that we can get to try to identify some of those important areas that birds are using along their migratory pathways, and just how different their patterns are, often depending on where they breed. So this is, these are two different variations in the migratory patterns for upland sandpipers. Again, the map on the left is the northbound flight, 6,166 kilometers in a 7-day period across the Andes and out over the Pacific Ocean over to Honduras for this individual in 1 week. This guy on its southbound trip from Cape Cod, I'm sorry, this is the northbound. Oh, you know what? This tab is wrong here. This figure, whoops, sorry. This bird just really don't try to get too much like I'm doing into the weeds looking at these numbers here. But the point is, these are just incredibly vast movements that these individuals are doing. Sometime over open water. Look at that, for 4 days, this guy. And just variable habitats that they're using too. So project that I've been doing since last year is in partnership with the Biodiversity Research Institute out of Portland, or BRI. They do a lot of research all around the world, and they are our co-grantees on this project we have with the Outdoor Heritage Fund, as well as IF&W, with really incredible, helpful permissions from the Passamaquoddy Wild Blueberry Company down east, and as well as some funding from the Nature Conservancy. And our goals really were to determine how their habitat use is in these blueberry barrens, and to track their dispersal patterns, much like the Wimbrel patterns or some of those other upland sandpiper projects throughout the annual cycle. This was the first year that we got bands of satellite transmitters on some birds. And we found that they're using both if those that don't know, industrial blueberry fields go through, it's an every other year type of cycle where they burn 1 year and then let that grow for a whole year and then harvest the following year. So it's this every other cycle. And we found that they use both parts of the blueberry barrens. So they're incredibly important to upland sandpipers, which are really the only mostly terrestrial upland species, as the name implies. Woodcock are actually a shorebird as well, that a lot of people don't really put that together. But so this was just data from this July. This one really knocked me out. This was one individual that we banded and had a transmitter on. And we were getting daily updates. I'm still getting daily updates, in fact. We have 5 transmitters on birds that BRI was able to get out in the summertime. This is one individual who, after breeding, it seemed like they were staying very close to its breeding ground. And then it just decided to up and head out up to New Brunswick, Canada. So it can be tough to track these things on a fine scale because the satellites only go online every 32 hours. And then they're up for a few hours at a time. So we only get kind of a snapshot every other day, basically. And in this particular moment, this bird was last tracked on July 26th. And the next time it came online, it was in New Brunswick, Canada, 186 kilometers away, or 115 miles. And then it took its time coming back. No, I shouldn't say that. It did do some hopscotching along the way and came right back to the exact same spot within 3 days of leaving. So it's like, what are these guys doing in the middle of the year? There's middle of the season too. We'd have no idea about these types of movements if it weren't for some of this technology out there. I do have some information too that one of our 5 birds stopped transmitting. Now that could either mean like the other ones that are the Wimbrels, that either the transmitter had a malfunction or the bird died possibly. But 4 of the other birds, I was hoping to be able to present some of this tonight, but I don't have the visual information yet from BRI. But 4 of the birds left within 4 days of each other at the end of August and into the first couple of days of September, and went straight out over the ocean, kind of like, or from Maine here, they went straight out like this in roughly the same kind of pattern, and all landed within a couple hundred miles of each other on the northern South American coast. And it took them about 3 days to make that trip. It varied a little bit by individual, but just really, really remarkable movement stuff. And I'm really hoping that at least 1 or 2 of these guys survives the winter so we can see how they come back as well. But that's really exciting. I really enjoy that movement stuff. But most of you, I didn't want to focus too much on piping plovers because They're pretty well known and well talked about in southern Maine. But for those who don't know, here's a piping plover. Nests on sandy beaches. They're kind of a sandy colored too, from the Carolinas all the way up to Newfoundland, Canada. They lay their egg. I just looked at the time here, so I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. They lay their eggs right on the ground, usually in a net clutch of 4. It takes about 28 days for the eggs to hatch, and both the males and females take turns incubating. If you see this, you're too close to a nest, or there's chicks nearby. This is a broken wing display tactic that some piping plovers will do to try to lure you, or what they perceive you to be, a predator of either their eggs or their young, away from the area, and to chase them instead. The chicks hatch, and what's really unique about them, a lot of shorebird species actually, is that they can move within a couple hours of hatching, and they're extremely vulnerable because they're tiny, like the size of a cotton ball and a toothpick, and the parents watch over them, but they can get separated easily by walkers. They're easily missed because they're so small, and often hunker down in a footprint in the sand. But they grow incredibly fast from that little cotton ball and a toothpick here to almost a full-size bird. This is the same individual from a study project in New Jersey that was tracked this bird over time. I love these photos. I think it's so cool. It gives a really interesting idea of how fast they grow. And of course, for them to grow that fast, they need to be eating a lot. Our numbers, as many of you know, have just really taken off in the last 4 or 5 years. We've somehow managed to more than double the population of piping plovers. And a big part of that is the partnerships we have with volunteers. I know many of you on this call are volunteers for our piping plover program. So thank you, thank you, thank you. That's incredibly helpful for us to obtain federal funding, where the majority of our funding comes from volunteers like you folks out there. Also buy-in from towns and the different departments and public works and parks and rec and emergency and police and fire and lifeguards and so on and so forth. It really does take a village. And these numbers over the last few years, the number in orange is how we measure success, or when a chick makes it to fledging after about 4 weeks or so. So to see that number, that orange line is just on a crazy trajectory. We never thought we'd reach this population. One way, if anyone wants to get involved, is to participate in Manomet's International Shorebird Survey. That has been going on since 1974. And it's really expanded our knowledge and built a nice long-term data set out there. And it uses the eBird platform. And certainly anyone who wants more information on these can reach out to me for more information. I'm not going to talk too much about them right now, but it is a way for folks to be involved, to survey the same areas once a week or every 10 days. In the peak times in the spring and the fall are really important. And as I kind of indicated earlier, we've really started to build up some partnerships in South America and the Caribbean too. So this bar graph here on the right, you can see these orange lines have really grown a lot. And that's because of a lot of the networking range wide, no longer is it a biologist in Maine interested in Maine birds, but I'm interested in what are they doing in the non-breeding grounds too. And it's working with partners in those countries that really helps us expand our knowledge base and helps protect the species too. And again, I can talk more about this if anyone wants to offline. Certainly send me an email or something, but I mentioned Scarborough Marsh and its importance to shorebirds, and Pine Point and around here into these flats, and even way up into the salt pans and salt marsh. One of the best birding spots this series of salt pans off the Eastern Trail here, just before it hits the upland behind the Public Works Department where the school buses are parked. This is really productive, phenomenal shorebirding in there in the summertime. And of course, Higgins Beach, piping plovers, Scarborough Beach, piping plovers, Western Beach, piping plovers, Ferry Beach, lots of ducks. But Scarborough is incredibly diverse and so rich in different habitats that it's super important for these birds, both migratory and the breeder, like the pipers. Oftentimes, this is what you'll see during a survey, and you'll have to try to estimate these numbers. So put in the chat how many birds you think that is, if anyone is interested. I have a pretty good idea on how many this is. The easiest part with these big kind of numbers is to take a subset and say, oh, that's about 10, 20, 30, 40, so on and so forth. But just kind of a fun estimating game to play. You can see why we might call them peeps when you've got a flock like this. Of course, this is a blurry picture, which doesn't help, but it can be tough to pick out different species in there. But I'm going to wrap it up there. So we still have some time for questions if anyone wants to let it rip.
I don't see any questions yet. Feel free to write some questions in the chat. Also, maybe if anyone has any experiences volunteering to help with the piping plovers or other species, you could let us know in the chat and we can unmute you and let you share some of your experiences if anyone would like to do that.
So we covered a lot of ground there.
Let's see. Got a question. How many someone wants to know the answer to the question. How many birds were in the photo?
I was just joking. I have no idea.
Thousands or hundreds?
Oh yeah, that was certainly 800 or more, I would say.
Could you tell us some about what has been the success of the piping plovers? Is it just education, people restraining their dogs in certain areas, or what other?
In certain areas, but really, yeah, it's word of mouth and just education. I can say that they're doing well in Maine, but they're not in most other places. Our colleagues in Canada are really struggling. The Mid-Atlantic got hammered this year. A lot of it is just plain old-fashioned luck. I think it was the Mother's Day storm. I see some hands coming in. Let me just finish this. And the mother that we lost 10% of our nests to wash over. New Jersey lost 90% of their nests, and they have a couple hundred more birds, more pairs than we do. So a lot of that is luck, dodging those storms, dodging the high tides that always seem to wash over the lunar tide every month.
Barbara, do you have a question?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yep.
Okay. They take somewhat different routes going south than north. Is that because of the currents of the wind?
It can be. These guys seem to have an innate knowledge, especially on the southbound, to ride that jet stream out and over. And oftentimes you'll see them swing out to the southeast and avoid the Caribbean. And that you think about the timing that a lot of those birds are migrating south, it's hurricane season. They seem to have an innate ability to dodge storms. and that's hardwired in them somehow. But incidentally, our banded upland sandpipers this year, I think, was shortly after they left, was one of those, the big storm that hit Puerto Rico. So yeah, a lot of it has to do with currents, air currents. A lot of it has to do with prey base at certain times of year and what they eat. Like I mentioned, a lot of those birds are really dependent on Delaware Bay horseshoe crabs, which only come up once a year. They've evolved over thousands of years to try to hit the same time when those horseshoe eggs are coming, or horseshoe crabs are coming to lay their eggs. So there's a lot at play. It's really complicated stuff, and every species is different. So pretty neat. Thanks for the question, Barbara.
Welcome.
Anyone else?
Stephanie, you have a question? Let's see.
Hey, hi, Steph.
Did you Photoshop those boots on the bird in the last picture?
It stopped by Rennie's on its way down, I think.
Was that it?
They're very cute birds, I must say, especially those little plover chicks.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So if anyone's interested and hasn't done so already, reach out to either me or Jamie Fitch, the sustainability coordinator with the town of Scarborough, and sign up to be a volunteer monitor on your local beach.
Yeah.
I know there are several. Shout out to Betsy Barrett, big help on Western Beach. And many others out there. Lucy, Peggy.
Well, I want to thank you, Brad. That was a great presentation. And if anyone wants to watch it again in a couple days, we will have the recording up on our website. And I do apologize. I'm not sure what happened to the chat, but hopefully you were all able to ask questions at the end if you wanted to. And I also want to thank once again the Friends of the Scarborough Marsh for helping to promote this program and for putting us in touch with you and coming up with the idea. So thanks again to them, and we'll all see you all next time at a future program. So thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Fred.
My pleasure. Thank you.